I was the investigator who found the payment records. Not the smoking gun everyone talks about now. The actual records, the gift logs, the hotel invoices, the wire transfer confirmations with handwritten notes in the margins. This was Salt Lake City, Winter Olympics 2002. I joined the IOC Ethics Commission in November 1998, 3 weeks after the first allegations surfaced. My background was forensic accounting, European banking regulations. I'd worked fraud cases for 11 years before this. The bid committee had given gifts to IOC members and their families for 7 years. Cash payments, scholarships, medical procedures, real estate assistance, jobs for relatives. The official IOC gift limit was $150 per member. We found $400,000 in scholarships alone. Ski trips valued at $12,000 per person. Plastic surgery procedures billed to shell companies in 3 countries. An apartment lease in Budapest paid 18 months in advance. A job offer letter for an IOC member's son at a Salt Lake consulting firm. Salary $95,000. Start date 2 weeks after the host city vote. A payment of $70,000 labeled humanitarian assistance that went directly into a personal bank account in Lausanne. Super Bowl tickets. A violin. A Stradivarius, actually. Loaned, not given. But the insurance premium alone was $6,000 annually, paid by the bid committee for 3 years. I documented every transaction. I created matrices. I cross-referenced dates with IOC voting records. I interviewed 14 members who had received gifts. Most were polite. Some were offended I was asking. One member told me the gifts were tokens of friendship. Cultural exchange, he called it. He said I didn't understand how relationships work in the Olympic movement. The voting for the 2002 host city took place in June 1995. Salt Lake won on the first ballot. 54 votes to 14 over Östersund, Sweden. By January 1999, we had enough documentation to prove systemic corruption. The gifts weren't isolated gestures. They were a strategy. A 7-year campaign designed to secure votes through financial inducement. The IOC expelled 6 members. 10 others resigned. The commission I worked for recommended sweeping reforms, no more visits to bid cities by IOC members, no more individual cultivation, transparent voting procedures, independent ethics oversight. We called it the biggest crisis in Olympic history. The Salt Lake Organizing Committee was investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice. 2 executives were indicted on 15 felony counts. Bribery, fraud, conspiracy. The trial lasted 3 months. Both were acquitted. 3 months before the scandal broke, I was offered a position. Chief Compliance Officer for the 2006 Turin Winter Games. The offer came from an IOC member I'd worked with during the investigation process. Someone on the reform side. Someone I respected. The salary was €220,000 annually. Housing included. 3-year contract. 4 times what I was making. I told him I couldn't accept while the investigation was active. He said he understood. He said the offer would remain open until I finished my work. The investigation took 14 months. I delivered my final report in March 1999. 63 pages. 82 documented violations. Recommendations for permanent structural reform. The IOC implemented most of them. We became the model for how international sports federations handle corruption. Transparent, accountable, self-correcting. I accepted the Turin position in April 1999. I told myself it was different. The offer had come after I'd proven my integrity, after I'd shown I couldn't be compromised. The IOC needed people like me in operational roles, not just investigative ones. The reforms only mattered if someone ensured they were actually followed. I told myself that for 3 years. The thing about gift limits is they assume you can measure value objectively. $150. Clear line. But what's the value of a job offer? Not the job itself, the offer. The signal that you're the kind of person important people want around. What's the value of being in the room when the new rules get written? In Turin, I built the compliance framework everyone still references. Gift disclosure forms, quarterly audits, whistleblower protections, real enforcement mechanisms. I was very good at my job. I stayed in the Olympic movement for 12 years after Salt Lake. I worked 3 more games. I spoke at conferences about ethics in sport governance. I taught a graduate seminar on institutional corruption at Sciences Po. I never declared the initial job offer in any conflict of interest screening. It wasn't technically required. The offer came from an individual, not the organization. It preceded my operational role. And I'd completed the investigation with full integrity. My findings were never questioned. My methodology never challenged. But the reason I got that offer was the investigation. The reason I was valuable to the IOC was that I'd proven I could handle sensitive information discreetly, that I understood the difference between transparency and exposure, that I knew which details strengthened the institution and which details would only damage it further. I found payment records worth $400,000 and called it systemic corruption. Someone else found my value and called it a job opportunity. The difference isn't in the amounts. It's in who's writing the report. I still have the signed offer letter. I keep it in a file marked Turin Personnel. Sometimes I take it out and read the date. November 18th. 3 weeks after I started investigating Salt Lake. 6 months before I recommended expelling anyone. The reforms were real. The expelled members were guilty. The accountability mechanisms function. I stand by every finding in that report. But I understand now what that IOC member meant. About how relationships work. The question I can't answer is whether I would have written the same report if the offer had never come. Not because I compromised my findings. I didn't. Every recommendation I made was justified by evidence. Every expulsion I proposed had documentation to support it. But there were 53 people I investigated. I recommended action against 17. The other 36 had what I called insufficient evidence for formal proceedings. What I categorized as advisory warnings or monitoring recommendations or contextual irregularities that didn't meet the threshold for disciplinary action. I wrote those phrases. I created those categories. And some of those 36 had done things that looked remarkably similar to what the 17 had done. The amounts were comparable. The relationships were equivalent. The timeline of payments and decisions followed the same pattern. The difference was how I framed the narrative around them. 3 months into the investigation, I had a conversation with Marcus Whitfield. He was the IOC member who'd made the comment about relationships. We met in Geneva, ostensibly to discuss procedural questions about the Salt Lake inquiry. He took me to lunch at a restaurant near the lake. Private room, just the 2 of us. He asked me how the investigation was progressing. I told him I was finding significant irregularities, that the scope of the corruption was wider than initially anticipated, that it implicated both the bid committee and several IOC members. He listened carefully, took a sip of wine. Then he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said, "The IOC has survived 2 world wars, boycotts, terrorism, and doping scandals. We survive because we understand the difference between accountability and destruction." I asked him what he meant. He said, "You're about to deliver findings that will define this organization for the next decade. You need to think carefully about what story you're telling. Are you telling a story about a corrupt institution that needs to be dismantled? Or are you telling a story about a fundamentally sound institution that identified and removed bad actors?" He never told me what to write. He never suggested I omit anything or falsify evidence. He just asked me what story I was telling. 2 weeks later, the job offer came. Director of Ethics and Compliance, based in Lausanne. Salary that was 3 times what I was making. 5-year contract with renewal options. I told myself it was separate. The offer came from Sarah Chen, the IOC's Director of Operations, not from Marcus. Different reporting structure, different division. The offer letter specifically stated it was contingent upon successful completion of current professional obligations with no expectation of particular outcomes. Legally airtight, ethically transparent, completely defensible. I didn't disclose it because I didn't have to. The offer was from an individual IOC employee, not from the organization under investigation. My contract allowed me to pursue future employment. There was no regulation requiring disclosure of preliminary employment discussions. I looked. I spent 3 days reviewing every ethics guideline, every conflict of interest policy, every professional standard that applied to my role. None of them required disclosure. So I continued the investigation, and I started making choices about categories, about thresholds, about which evidence was conclusive and which was merely suggestive. There was a payment from the Salt Lake Committee to the daughter of an IOC member. $25,000 listed as a consulting fee for services that were never clearly documented. The daughter was 19 years old, a college student, no expertise in Olympic planning or sports administration. I categorized it as inappropriate but not clearly corrupt. My reasoning was that the daughter had apparently done some translation work, that there were emails showing she'd participated in at least 2 conference calls, that while the amount was excessive for the work performed, there was technically work performed. There was another payment to a different IOC member's son, $30,000, similar circumstances, also categorized as consulting fees. The son was 21. He'd apparently helped coordinate some promotional materials. I recommended expulsion for that one. The difference in my report came down to tone and framing. For the daughter, I wrote about questionable judgment and excessive compensation for legitimate services. For the son, I wrote about corrupt procurement and nepotistic enrichment schemes. The evidence was nearly identical. The first IOC member was Marcus Whitfield's colleague and occasional golf partner. The second was someone who had publicly criticized the IOC's governance structure and called for more external oversight. I didn't realize what I was doing at the time. Or maybe I did, but I convinced myself I was making legitimate analytical distinctions, that I was applying prosecutorial discretion that every investigation requires judgment calls about where to draw the line. The report took 6 months to complete. By the time I delivered it, I'd already signed the employment contract with the IOC. I'd found an apartment in Lausanne. I'd been planning my transition. The report recommended 17 expulsions, 12 suspensions, and institutional reforms. It was covered in every major newspaper. Multiple governments launched their own investigations. The IOC created new ethics committees, new oversight mechanisms, new transparency requirements, real reforms, meaningful accountability. And 36 people whose actions were documented in my files but never made it into the formal findings. I took the IOC position 3 months later. There was some criticism. A few journalists questioned the optics of the investigator joining the organization he'd investigated, but my defenders outnumbered my critics. They pointed out that hiring me demonstrated the IOC's commitment to reform, that bringing in someone with my investigative background would strengthen their ethics infrastructure, that I'd proven I couldn't be bought. I lasted 18 months in the position, not because I was fired or forced out. My performance reviews were excellent. I implemented 3 new compliance programs. I expanded the ethics hotline. I developed training modules that became standard across the organization. I left because I couldn't sleep. There was a moment, about a year into the job, when I was reviewing a complaint about improper payments related to the Sydney Olympics. Someone had submitted evidence of a bidding committee member providing gifts to IOC officials. As I read through the materials, I recognized the name of one of the IOC officials. It was someone who'd been in my Salt Lake files. Someone I'd categorized as insufficient evidence. Someone whose case file I'd marked as advisory warning only. I sat at my desk in Lausanne, looking at this new complaint, and I realized I was in the position to investigate my own previous judgment. I could pull my old files, compare the evidence, see if the pattern I documented but not acted on in Salt Lake was now repeating in Sydney. I closed the file. I referred it to an external investigator, citing my prior involvement in related matters. I went home that night and started drafting my resignation letter. Marcus Whitfield took me to lunch again when I announced I was leaving. Same restaurant, same private room. He said he was sorry to see me go, that I'd done excellent work, that the organization was stronger because of my contributions. Then he paused and he said, "You know what the real skill is? It's not finding corruption. Any competent investigator can find corruption. The real skill is knowing how much corruption to find." He smiled when he said it, like he was sharing professional wisdom, like he was acknowledging that I'd learned something important. I think about that lunch often, about whether he knew what he was telling me, about whether I knew what I was hearing. The reforms from my report are still in place. The expelled members never return to the IOC. The accountability mechanisms function. But sometimes I take out those 36 files, the ones I kept copies of, the ones marked insufficient evidence, and I read through them and I try to remember what made the evidence insufficient. Whether it was the documentation or the date on the offer letter.